Did I do it? I think I successfully did it. Hello, everyone. Peter here from the B2B Institute, coming to you live from the Green Void of New York City. It's a good thing you can't see my apartment. You can't even imagine how tiny this space is, but delighted to be here on B2B Day, the most magical day of the year. And today I'm going to talk about how B2B brands grow. So first I will attempt to share my screen. Hopefully that works. Let me know if it doesn't. So this is really our latest research with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. Hopefully most of the people on this call know that there are these laws of physics. So these generalizable principles like gravity that really explain how the whole universe works. You know, everything from shooting stars to falling apples. I think what most of us may not know are that there's also these laws of growth in marketing, these fundamental principles that explain how brands grow in B2C and B2B across categories, across markets. At an ANA conference in July, I asked people to raise their hand if they had heard of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. I think there was like 100 people in the room and a single hand went up, and it was Professor Peter Fader, which doesn't really count. So awareness of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute is pretty low, and those are really the experts researching the laws of growth. So there's this book, this legendary book, How Brands Grow. Legend has it that on day one at Procter & Gamble, every new marketer is handed a copy of this book and told to study it, told that these are the laws of growth and we need to sort of adhere to them. Most B2B marketers are kind of unfamiliar with this research, with this book, with these laws, and we've had a very convenient excuse, which is that most of the data and insights in the research comes from B2C categories. So I think B2B marketers assume these must not be our laws, you know, B2B works differently. Well, I'm delighted to tell you that that's not necessarily true. And actually what we've done is replicate the Ehrenberg Bass research in B2B. So what I'm going to attempt to prove to you today is that there are these kind of laws that explain how B2B brands grow. The laws are not widely known. They're not widely practiced. You'll probably not agree with them. And I apologize in advance if I offend anyone, but you know, the laws of gravity are true whether we believe in them or not. And I would say a lot of these principles are true whether B2B marketers believe in them or not. So before I tell you about the laws, I'm going to tell you a bedtime story about a little brand called Salesforce. So most people have heard of Salesforce, right? We recognize the name, the logo. We're familiar with Dreamforce, which is the biggest marketing conference or biggest business conference in the world. We are familiar with Salesforce Tower, which looms over the San Francisco skyline. So Salesforce is a famous brand. And yet, a few years ago, the marketers at Salesforce had a simple but profound insight, which is that even though everyone had heard of Salesforce, nobody really knew what Salesforce sold or what they were actually supposed to buy from Salesforce. So if you listen to Colin Fleming, who's the SVP of brand and an extremely talented marketer, he essentially realized that Salesforce has a brand awareness problem, which is kind of an odd idea, a very famous brand that has a brand awareness problem. But that's really what we've learned, is that every brand has a brand awareness problem, even very famous brands. Now, Colin called this a brand awareness problem. The geniuses at the Ehrenberg Bass Institute would call it something else. They would say that what Salesforce really had was a mental availability problem. So mental availability is kind of the core foundational concept in the Ehrenberg Bass revolution that has transformed B2C and that we think will transform B2B. So what is mental availability? Mental availability is the likelihood that your brand comes to mind in a variety of buying situations. You know, in B2B, we tend to stress the sort of rational nature of purchases, but the truth is that almost no decision is rational. Most decisions are really made automatically. So the second something pops into our head, that's usually what we do. The brand that pops into your head in a buying situation is usually the brand that gets bought That's true whether we're talking about toothpaste or whether we're talking about cloud computing. There may be more rational processing behind a B2B decision once you're in the consideration set, but ultimately, the brand that comes to mind is usually the brand that gets bought. So really armed with this insight, Salesforce launched the Trailblazers campaign. It's a brand campaign, but I would say it really had a mental availability goal. The goal was to link the Salesforce brand to a variety of CRM buying situations. It was and is still a pretty astonishing success story. Salesforce's brand metrics have pretty much doubled since launch, but more importantly, so have their financial metrics. So this is really the power of mental availability. What Salesforce did may sound somewhat obvious, but it's actually apparently not very obvious in B2B. It's actually very unusual to launch a brand campaign in B2B. Most B2B marketers are really pretty obsessed with the bottom of the funnel, with sales activation. Everybody wants to get cheaper leads tomorrow, clicks, those kinds of things. We see very few B2B marketers with straight up brand awareness goals, something like 16%. And the number of B2B marketers with mental availability goals, probably somewhere around 0%. And frankly, a lot of the brand marketers in B2B are really like direct response marketers in disguise, who evaluate the success of their campaigns, not on how much mental availability it generates, but on how many clicks or leads it generated. We see most campaigns, even brand campaigns, ultimately evaluated on a CPC basis. So all the attention in B2B has flowed towards the bottom of the funnel. But it's a real shame because actually, if you look at the evidence, the single most important marketing objective you can have, whether you're a big company or a small company, is really to increase your mental availability. I've talked to a lot of clients who think they have a lead gen problem, but they usually don't have a lead gen problem. They have a brand awareness problem because you can't become a lead for a product you don't even know exists. And there is a very tight causal relationship between your mental mind share, so how easily you come to mind, and your actual market share. Unlike things like click-through rate, this is a marketing metric that's actually proven to lead to a financial outcome. So mental availability is really the key idea. But I think what I want to talk about are these laws of growth that I think really explain why mental availability matters and ultimately how you grow a brand in B2B. So we're going to start with my personal favorite idea, which is called the 95-5 rule. And I'm going to kind of kick off each of these laws with the myth, or what I would call the consensus opinion in the B2B marketing industry. And then I'll give you the contrarian take from the B2B Institute. Let's start with the myth. I think most B2B marketers think that marketing works something like this. If you develop some sufficiently persuasive piece of creative and you put it in front of a buyer, the buyer will drop everything and immediately go out and buy your products and services. Now, I think most of us know intuitively that marketing doesn't work that way, but we really act like it works that way. Most of us expect to see immediate sales results, significant sales results, after, say, 2 weeks of launching a campaign. And that's because we think that marketing pulls people down a funnel. So you make them aware, then you convince them to consider you, then you convince them to buy you. I don't think that's actually how marketing works. I don't think that marketing pulls buyers down a funnel. I think it usually works by influencing buyers who aren't even in the funnel yet and won't be for some time. This sort of vertical mental model of marketing with awareness at the top, purchase at the bottom, I think it's problematic. I think we've got to actually flip the funnel on its side and think about growth over time. And essentially any business, B2B or B2C, really has two different customer segments. So people who are in market for your products and services right now, and people who will be in market in the future. And the future could mean 5 days from now, it could mean 5 months from now, it could mean 5 years from now. Every B2B marketer I meet is obsessed with figuring out who's in market based on some kind of intent signal and converting them with like an aggressive lead gen ad or call to action. The problem is that nobody's really in market. So that's what the 95-5 rule states from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. It's that something like 5% of buyers are in market at any given time, and 95% of buyers are out of market. And generally, the more infrequently purchased the product, the less people are in market at any given time. And most B2B categories are purchased pretty infrequently, whether we're talking about buying computers for a corporation, or changing your principal banks, or in B2C, high consideration B2C, purchasing a car. These aren't things that people do every day. The likelihood that you're going to reach a B2B buyer on the exact day when they're considering switching banks is like 1,000,000 to 1. So what does all of this mean? If most buyers are out of market, it means, first of all, the short-term effects of marketing and certainly of advertising are just pretty limited. You can be really, really good at converting the people who are in market, but nobody's in market. So the opportunity has a real ceiling to it. You should really think about what this looks like for your own category. So let's say you're in cloud. You should think about, what is the purchase frequency for cloud? Let's say it's once every 5 years. That means if you're only looking at a month time frame, probably 2% of accounts are in market. And that could be worth, let's say, $4 billion, but you're only going to get a small segment of that, right? Because you have to share those customers with your competitors. If you broaden your time horizon and think about, say, the next 5 years, there could be millions of accounts up for grabs. So, I'm not a mathematician, I should disclose that, but I'm pretty sure $1.5 billion is a much bigger number than $40 billion. So the revenue opportunity is much bigger in future customers, future out-of-market customers, than the in-market opportunity. I think what we love most about this idea is that it tracks pretty closely to how finance sees the world. I think we all know finance is often the biggest barrier to brand investments in B2B. But finance people, like CFOs, think in terms of current cash flows and future cash flows. So how much money I expect to make today, how much money I expect to make in the future. And if you actually look at how businesses are valued based on future cash flows. Something like 80% of the value of a stock is based on future cash flows. So if you were to talk to your CFO, I think how you would frame this is, how is our business valued based on future cash flows? Where do future cash flows come from? They come from future customers. What type of marketing influences future customers? It's obviously not buy now lead gen advertising, because that's not going to work on somebody who doesn't need to buy for another 3 years. It's brand marketing that just makes the brand top of mind, so that when you enter the market, when you go in market, that's the brand you think of, that's the brand you choose. So that is ultimately the power of mental availability. It's how you influence future customers. And some of you might be thinking, okay, but why can't I just wait until they come in market? 2 reasons. Number one, very hard to time the market. The bankers would tell you not to try to time the market, right? Don't try to buy and sell stocks at very particular times. Instead, just buy in all the time and wait for your returns to compound. Same thing is true in marketing. Just very difficult to time the market and know when somebody's going to go in market. And frankly, even if you could time the market, it still wouldn't work, because you need to build brand awareness and mental availability over the course of years or decades. If you wait until the buyer comes in market, it's too late, because your competitors have been building the brand years previously. That's the brand that's going to come to mind. So that is the point made here by Professor John Dawes, the genius behind the 95-5 rule, who basically says, to grow a brand, you need to increase your mental availability among people who are not yet in market. So that's the 95-5 rule. I think of all the things I have learned over the past 5 years, it's probably the one that has most changed how I see B2B marketing effectiveness, how you think about your segmentation, your creative, your targeting, your measurement. To a certain degree, I think all of that needs to be rethought through the lens of most buyers being out of market. Our second law, and we have 3, is called the law of duplicate purchase, which sounds incredibly boring, but it's actually not boring. It's super edgy and controversial. So what is the law of duplicate purchase? Again, let's start with the myth. If any of you studied marketing in school, you probably learned something like this. You got to own a niche segment of the market. and you've got to appeal to that segment with differentiated targeting and differentiated positioning and differentiated products. This is how marketing works in a textbook. It doesn't appear to be how marketing works in reality. There's two big problems with this mental model. The first problem is that it doesn't look like brands grow by owning a customer niche or a specific set of customers. In reality, it looks like all brands sell to the same customer, which is anyone who buys the category. So let me just start with a B2C example, because B2C is often easier to understand. In marketers' imaginations, Coke and Diet Coke sell to completely different audiences because of their differentiated products and positionings. Here on planet Earth, Diet Coke and Coke sell to the same exact segment, the same exact customer, which is people with mouths who are thirsty. That is their ideal target customer. Same person who buys Coke, buys Diet Coke, buys Pepsi, right? Every brand in the category is competing for the same exact customers. Same thing is true in B2B. You see, for instance, if you look at aviation fuel contracts, people who choose one vendor also choose all the other vendors. There's a huge amount of kind of promiscuity between buyers of a certain brand. Nobody has a lock on their customer base. So the niche model doesn't appear to bear out. That's a tough pill to swallow, but let me give you a much tougher pill to swallow, which is that despite the billions of dollars spent on trying to position our brands differently from our competitors, most brands are perceived exactly the same. If you actually line them up in a row on a bunch of brand attributes like trustworthiness, efficiencies, innovation, you see that basically every brand scores exactly the same. To the degree there are variations, it's usually explained by market share. In other words, people assume that very big companies are more trustworthy and have bigger products. It's called the halo effect, right? So the market share drives the perceptions. It's not the perceptions driving the market share. So what's going on here? You know, an unfavorable explanation would be that we're all terrible at our jobs. None of us know how to properly position our brands. I actually have a more generous interpretation, which is that marketers don't really control the perception of the brand, and that's not really how brands grow. Brands grow by increasing mental availability. So just coming to mind more easily versus influencing what people think about your brand. So this is really what the law of duplicate purchase says. It says that to grow, you need mental availability and you need to be able to compete with every brand in the category, especially the biggest brands. So I meet a lot of clients who like to flatter themselves by only comparing themselves to brands of a similar size. But if you're a big bank, it looks like most of your customers come from other big banks. If you're a medium-sized bank, most of your customers come from big banks. If you're a small bank, most of your customers come from big banks. Big banks have the most customers, so that's where a disproportionate share of your customers are going to come from. So you might think that you're competing on the basis of your differentiated positioning and that you only have to compete with people with a similar positioning. In actuality, you have to compete with anyone who sells in the same category that you do, and you need to be able to compete with the biggest brands. So this is really the key point. It's super controversial, so I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but for all the talk about differentiation, doesn't appear to be a lot of differentiation when it comes to product or brand perception. What you actually compete on is sheer mental availability, which is the likelihood that you come to mind in a variety of buying situations. If you ask Professor Jenny Romaniak, one of the greatest marketing minds of our time, you know, what this really means, well, it very much favors big brands because big brands already have a lot of mental availability since they have a lot of customers, and people are a lot more likely to notice communications from a big brand versus a small brand. So this, unfortunately, is just a reality of the situation that marketing generally favors big brands. And if you're a small brand, you have to work basically 10 times as hard to stand out and get noticed. And of course, there are ways to do that, but it's quite difficult. My final law for you is the double jeopardy law, probably the single most controversial idea in the whole Ehrenberg-Bass revolution. So everybody sharpen your pitchforks, get ready for this one. We'll start with the myth. The myth is that most marketers think there's really two ways to grow a brand. You can either acquire more customers or you can get existing customers to spend more money. And it's not just that marketers think there's two ways to grow. It's actually they think loyalty is the better way to grow. So getting existing customers to spend more money, much better than acquiring new customers. You hear a lot of marketers, for instance, say that it's more expensive to acquire a customer than to retain a customer, which is literally a myth that has no foundation whatsoever in the evidence, but that's a very commonly held belief in the marketing industry. The problem is that it doesn't look like there are two ways to grow. As far as I can tell, there's really only one way to grow, and it's to acquire new customers. Brands grow not by getting excess loyalty, but by getting excess penetration. And what you actually see if you line up all the brands in a category is that big brands with a lot of penetration have high loyalty. Smaller brands have less loyalty, but you don't see a lot of brands that have low penetration and super high loyalty. So again, in marketers' imaginations, there's these brands like Apple and Harley Davidson, which are successful not because they have a lot of customers, but because they've got this tribe of like diehard fans who love the brand, can't wait to talk about it with their friends. I don't think those brands really exist on planet Earth. Unfortunately, I don't think Apple's a big company because they have this tribe of loyal customers. They're a big company because they have a huge number of customers and they have extreme pricing power, right? We pay like $1,000 for a plastic rectangle, right? So it's not really loyalty driving these big brand success. It's ultimately penetration. And I think ultimately loyalty appears to mostly be a fixed number, and it's kind of a function of penetration. So in other words, again, the big brands will have more customers who are more loyal. Small brands get doubly penalized. That's why it's called double jeopardy. They have less customers who are less loyal. This seems to be true in pretty much every category, whether it's a subscription service or a portfolio service, whether it's B2B, whether it's B2C, whether it's concrete suppliers or coronary stents. I found this to be a very tough pill to swallow, by the way, but once Ehrenberg Bass shows you about 900 of these charts showing the same exact thing in every single category, ultimately you start to believe them. So listen, I get a little worried because I talk to a lot of marketers who say, you know, in some cases, their number one objective is not to acquire new customers, it's to increase retention or reduce churn. And I just worry those brands are setting themselves up to fail. I think they're kind of trying to defy gravity because your loyalty, again, seems to be mostly fixed based on your penetration. If you want more loyalty, you really got to go out and acquire a lot more customers. How do you acquire a lot more customers? You guessed it, mental availability. You know, people who already buy you, you know, have mental availability. They couldn't have bought you if they didn't. So really most brands grow by reaching non-buyers who don't have any mental availability and increasing it. So really all roads start and end with mental availability. That is the core concept here. And I think at this point you may be asking yourself, cool, I want to get some of that sweet, sweet mental availability. How do I actually build it? The good news is it's pretty straightforward. You basically need three things. First of all, you need to reach a ton of customers. There's all this focus on targeting and engagement and all these like somewhat distracting media metrics. At the end of the day, if you don't reach a buyer, you can't possibly influence the buyer. And advertising is a pretty weak force, and it only adds up at extreme scale. So you need to reach a huge number of buyers, more customers than you have, ideally more customers than your competitors. What do you reach them with, though? That's where the power of creative comes in. But what does good, effective creative look like? It's basically two things. Number one, is it attaching the brand to a buying situation, or what Ehrenberg Bass would call category entry points. So that's like, imagine this magical moment when the out-of-market buyer comes in market. What does that moment actually look like? Who is the buyer with? How are they feeling? What are their motivations? You need marketing that speaks to that buying situation so that you come to mind in that buying situation. And then you need extremely good branding. This is probably the largest source of waste in our whole industry, is that by our estimates, something like 60% of the time, buyers have no idea what brand is being advertised. So a lot of clients are actually just advertising for the category, like digital transformation. You don't want to advertise for the category, you want to advertise for your brand. So you need to make sure your logo's on the ad. You need to make sure all of your distinctive brand assets are heavily featured in everything you do. So ultimately you need reach, but you need to reach people with creative that speaks to buying situations and that is very heavily handed branding. You really cannot over brand something. The problem is under branding. It's not over branding. So thank you guys for listening to my rant. If you're interested in learning more, we're really working right now with LinkedIn's top customers to put a lot of these principles into practice via our B2B Edge program. So working with a handful of clients to actually apply the principles in the research, hoping to generate some case studies that we can take to B2B Day next year. Hugely appreciative of your time. Please reach out to me on a wonderful network called LinkedIn if you'd like to connect, if you have any questions. Me and my colleague John also write a regular column for Marketing Week, so you can always check that out. And I think that is it for me. So thank you.
Well, it's not it for you, Peter, because we got some questions.
Perfect. I'm here. Do we have, did I do my timing right? Are we good?
Fine. You did fine. So now we all have to go read How Brands Grow.
Highly recommend.
So thank you for that. So here are a couple of questions for you. How is mental availability different from brand awareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of subtle. It took me a while to get it too, but it's very different. Brand awareness is usually just like, have you heard of a brand? And if you're a big brand, that really stops being an interesting metric after a certain point. So if I'm like, have you heard of Microsoft? It's going to be 100% of people saying yes. Mental availability is really about thinking about all the reasons and situations in which you might need Microsoft's products and services and figuring out the degree to which Microsoft comes to mind in those situations. So I would say brand awareness is like a pretty shallow, one-dimensional way of measuring a brand. Mental availability is this more complicated, multi-dimensional way where you really understand where you're strong and weak based on which buying situations you come to mind in. So I think it's more evidence-based, it's more actionable because brands can brief their creative agency to help them come to mind in buying situations versus just like increasing awareness. And ultimately, I think it sounds a lot more financial to a CFO or a head of sales, talking about increasing the likelihood you come to mind in a buying situation versus talking about trust and purpose and love and a lot of the things that most of us are talking about in B2B marketing.
So, okay, here's another a question that I think we all want to know. What companies do you think are doing this right? We're being really heavy-handed in branding.
Yeah, listen, I have to give huge credit to Salesforce. I think Salesforce is one of the best B2B marketing organizations in the world. We've studied what they've done intensely. We spent a lot of time with the marketers over there. I think if you think about that Trailblazers campaign, number one, they set the right objective, which is mental availability. Number two, they're really doing it at massive scale. I mean, you've probably all seen the Trailblazers campaign somewhere. But then if you think about the messaging, it's to specific CRM buying situations. And then it is so well branded, to your question. It's got the logo, it's got Astro, this weird feral raccoon child in all of their marketing. It's got the same tagline everywhere. It's super heavy-handed. I'll also give a huge shout out to Brent Reinhardt, who I met via an ANA conference, whose Chase ads are remarkably well branded, some of the best branding I've seen in any marketing communication. So that's maybe a tech and a FinServ example for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. We've got a ton of questions in the Q&A. So if you have a chance after this closes, if you could go in and if you have time.
Of course. Happy to.
Fabulous.